In February 1850, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, they lost their son. His name was Edward Baker Lincoln. They called him Eddie. He was not yet 4 years old, but he died in Illinois in February of that year. February 1850, he died of illness. Later that same year, in December of 1850, another son was born to the Lincolns. His name was William Wallace Lincoln. They called him Willie. He was born in December 1850. And in February 1862, when Willie was 11 and a half years old, and by which time Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln were the President of the United States and the First Lady of the United States, on February 20th, 1862, the Lincolns lost yet another son. Willie Lincoln, age 11 and a half, died in the White House while his father was president and his mother was First Lady. He also died of childhood illness. He died of typhoid fever. And the president and the First Lady were plunged into just profound grief. Abraham Lincoln is now believed by many modern scholars to have suffered with fairly profound depression during his life and during his presidency. But what he and his wife went through in 1862 was something different. They had lost a first son in 1850, and then they had lost a second son who had been born just after they lost their first one. Lost both of these little boys in childhood. And the Lincolns had this to deal with on top of everything else that was upon them, right? With the country being in the grips of civil war. And in that dark year, in 1862, with everything else that was going on with the country and for the White House and for the Lincoln family, that winter in 1862, after his second son had died, President Lincoln got word that an old friend of his from Illinois, a man named William McCulloch, had been killed fighting for the Union Army in the Civil War in a battle in Mississippi. And, you know, one thing that is a real blessing about working in this building, working under the auspices of NBC News, is that I don't know that many other places where while you're doing your daily work, you have a presidential historian on standby at all times. But we've got that. Whenever it helps to be able to report or understand or contextualize the news, to know whether or not something is unprecedented, we can call NBC presidential historian Michael Beschloss at any time to see if there is something that he knows of from presidential history that could help explain what's going on now in our current life. So we contacted Michael Beschloss a couple of days ago for his help in trying to contextualize, trying to figure out if there was something unprecedented about President Trump's remarks in the Rose Garden on Monday, his sort of flippant remarks, his casual asides he made sort of glibly on Monday afternoon in the Rose Garden when he volunteered what turned out to be false information about previous presidents, particularly President Obama, and the ways those previous presidents had interacted with the families of soldiers who were killed in action. The president made those remarks on Monday in the Rose Garden, and it caused a great uproar. And we contacted Michael Beschloss to see if the president's remarks on that subject really were unprecedented, or maybe there was something else like this in U.S. history that we should remember at a time like this when we were talking about what President Trump did that upset so many people. In response to our query, Michael Beschloss sent us this letter. He told us about the long history of presidents sending letters and making sympathy phone calls and visiting with the families of fallen soldiers, and how profoundly that responsibility has affected various presidents over the years. But he sent this handwritten letter. He called this letter from Lincoln, quote, what I think is the most eloquent such letter. So the most eloquent condolence letter that a president has sent. And this letter is what Lincoln wrote when he learned in 1862 about the death of his friend William McCulloch fighting in the Civil War. Lincoln wrote this letter to McCulloch's daughter in that dark year of 1862 when he and the country and he and his own family were dealing with so much trauma and so much grief. And some of the power of this is seeing it in its handwritten form. But the words that Lincoln wrote are not just a historical artifact. they're still important as to what we expect of the presidency and what we understand as our moral inheritance as a nation. The way Michael Beschloss put it, he told us not only does he think this is the most eloquent example of a presidential condolence letter to the family of a fallen soldier, he told us, "I find it so beautiful that I think what Lincoln has written consoles anyone dealing emotionally with significant loss." So this is that letter from Lincoln. You can see at the top, it's on stationery that says the Executive Mansion, and then they've pre-printed in there Washington, comma, and then you fill in the date by hand and the year. December 23rd, 1862. The letter says, "Dear Fanny, it is with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. I'm anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is this not so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say. The memory of your dear father, instead of an agony, will yet be a sad, sweet feeling in your heart, of a purer and holier sort than you have known before." And then he signs off, "Please present my kind regards to your afflicted mother, your sincere friend, A. Lincoln." One page. That's how it's done, right? And every American president since Lincoln has the unfortunate reality of, at some point, being compared with Lincoln. No other president will ever be him. But having that document in our history, in our public record, as the standard of decency and moral generosity from a president, having that in kind of our ethical bank as a country, makes it almost impossible to compute what the current news cycle has just revealed, has just dredged up about the behavior of the current occupant of the same office that Abraham Lincoln once held. The widow of U.S. Army Sergeant LaDavid T. Johnson received a phone call from the president yesterday about the loss of her husband in an ISIS ambush in Niger. We learned about the content of that call late last night. We learned about what the president actually said to that grieving widow. And we learned it from the congresswoman who represents the district where Sergeant Johnson's family lives, who has known the family for years, and who was with Sergeant Johnson's widow when she received the president's call.
You spoke to the widow of LaDavid Johnson, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. Her name is Maisha. How is she doing tonight?
Oh, she's very distraught, and we were in the car together in the limousine headed to meet the body at the airport. So I heard what he said because the phone was on speaker.
What did he say?
Well, basically he said, well, I guess he knew what he signed up for, but I guess it still hurts. That's what he said.
The president said to her, he knew what he signed up for.
He knew what he was signing up for.
But when it happens, it hurts anyway.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if this is a young woman who has 2 children, who is 6 months pregnant with a 3rd child. She has just lost her husband. She was just told that he cannot have an open casket funeral, which gives her all kinds of nightmares, how his body must look, how his face must look. And this is what the President of the United States says to her?
So after that account from the congresswoman last night and again this morning, she reiterated her comments this morning on MSNBC. The president today was asked by reporters if he honestly said that to that grieving widow last night, and this was his response.
Mr. President, what did you say to Sergeant Johnson's widow on the phone yesterday?
Didn't say what that congresswoman said. Didn't say it at all. She knows it, and she now is not saying it. I did not say what she said, and I'd like her to make the statement again, because I did not say what she said. I had a very nice conversation with the woman, with the wife, who sounded like a lovely woman, did not say what the Congresswoman said, and most people aren't too surprised to hear that.
What is the proof, Mr. President?
Let her make her statement again, and then you'll find out.
Saying that you said this.
Okay, let her make her statement again, and then you'll find out.
So after the president, with his arms folded, denied that account about this call to this grieving widow, Congresswoman Wilson said she stood by her account of what the president had said in that conversation. She had not retracted her account. She stood by it. And although the president insisted today that he had proof that he had not said any of those things that the Congresswoman had quoted him saying, turns out, if you're looking for proof, well, it wasn't just the Congresswoman who was listening in on that conversation with Sergeant Johnson's widow. That was a conversation in which the president was on speakerphone, and the people who heard his remarks included not only Sergeant Johnson's widow and the Congresswoman, but another member of Sergeant Johnson's family, who also confirms that the Congresswoman's account is correct, that is what the president said. She told the Washington Post today, quote, "President Trump did disrespect my son and my daughter and also me and my husband." Kalonda Jones-Jackson, Sergeant Johnson's mother, confirmed it again to the New York Times tonight. Asked if the president did say he knew what he was getting into when he signed up, she confirmed to the New York Times tonight, quote, "Yes, he did state that comment." And it is one thing if the president inadvertently spoke in an unintentionally callous manner to somebody he should have prepared better to speak to. That's one thing. That's its own kind of failure. It's its own size failure. It is another matter when the president then, called on that, chooses to deride the grieving family of a fallen soldier as liars. Now, in the uproar caused by these revelations today, we then learned that the president had also, sometime this summer, called the father of an Army sergeant named Dylan Baldridge, who was killed in Afghanistan in June. In the middle of his call with the president, Chris Baldridge, the father, says his conversation with the president took an unexpected turn when the president volunteered in the middle of their conversation, quote, "I'm going to write you a check out of my personal account for $25,000. So the president, speaking with this grieving father, the father of an American U.S. Army corporal who was killed, the president, in speaking with him, told him he was going to send the father a large personal check. According to the grieving father, this happened in the conversation after the dad said he didn't expect to benefit from the Pentagon's death benefit for his son. He thought that would all go to his wife. And it's an unusual, certainly an interesting thing for the president to have promised that he would personally make a financial contribution to this father. To Chris Baldridge, to the father, it was reportedly a shocking thing that the president had offered to send him personally some money. It's all interesting. It's all unusual. The part that's nauseating is the Washington Post's further reporting that President Trump didn't actually send the check after he told that grieving dad that he would. Didn't send him the check. Not apparently until today, when the news of him not sending the check ended up being reported in the Washington Post. After hours of dodging Washington Post reporters on this story, Post reporters who had spoken to this father, had heard about the president's promise to send him money, and had heard the grieving father say the president's check never arrived. After hours of trying to check this out with the White House, and the White House not responding, and the White House not giving any explanation what happened with the president's personal financial offer to this grieving father. Eventually, this evening, a White House spokeswoman put out an angry statement calling the media disgusting and saying, quote, "The check has been sent." It has been further reported this evening that what she meant by that was the check was sent tonight, once the president's broken promise became national news. Beyond that, the president's remarks on this subject this week appeared to have just dragged many of these grieving families through it. President Trump has only been in office for 9 months, so anybody who's been killed in action since he's been president, it's a relatively recent occurrence. Those families can all be expected to be raw and hurt and actively grieving, and in some cases, they may still be actively dealing with the logistics and circumstances and handling of their loved one's death. Knowing that circumstance, knowing the fresh grief of these families, in terms of what they're going through right now, it makes reporting like this from the Washington Post tonight almost impossible for us to absorb as Americans. Given our history as a country and the way we have dealt with these things in the past, it is almost impossible to believe this is real. But this is quoting from the Washington Post tonight. Sergeant Roshane Brooks, age 30, was killed on August 13th in Iraq. His father, Yuvence Brooks, has not heard from the White House. The president's claim this week that he had called every military family to lose a son or daughter since he has been president only upset the Brooks family more. Brooks said after watching the news on Tuesday night, he wanted to set up a Twitter account to try to get the president's attention. Quote, "I said to my daughter, can you teach me to tweet so I can tweet at the president and tell him he is a liar?" You know when you hear people lying and you want to fight? That's the way I feel. He's a damn liar. And nobody wants to live in a country where people can credibly call the leader of the country a damn liar. But when that credible, in this case, well-founded complaint can be waged by somebody whose son just died in uniform fighting for the United States of America, we don't have very many circuits as Americans to process this kind of moral disgrace in our leadership. I mean, it's just hard for us as a country to face the loss borne by families of service members anyway, even in normal times. Such a tiny proportion of U.S. families have anybody serving in the military, while the U.S. Armed Forces have fought the longest war in U.S. history and other wars alongside it. There have been less than 1% of American families who've got somebody serving while those wars have been happening. And civilian life has proceeded basically as if those wars are not happening. It's therefore already hard for us as a country to face the sacrifices and the losses that these patriotic families have gone through, right? They've done something we civilians will never do. They've incurred a debt from this country that we don't know how to pay back already. So it's hard in normal times. But it's incomprehensible for us as a country to see those families, of all people, jerked around and lied to and slimed and called liars by the president very shortly after these service members died. And so this just feels like a strange news story to report. It feels surreal. It feels so unbelievable. But this is happening. I want to say, though, that there is something else that's happening here, too. That isn't just a moral decency thing. It's a political tactic that's at work here, and not a dumb political tactic. And that story's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.